So if you were not here last week, I apologize because we're right in the middle of something. We're going to continue our study of omniscience. Going back to last week, though, I want to make a correction. Last week when I was discussing middle knowledge, I think I said that middle knowledge is about God's knowledge of subjective conditionals. The word is actually subjunctive conditionals. So let me write that down. So remember, a subjunctive conditional is an if-then statement that I talked about last week. Like, if I were David Scott, then I would sell my boat. And that's what a subjunctive conditional is. So again, I just wanted to make a correction. Also for those people that were listening at home and was like, he said it wrong. Listen this week, and now you'll know. So last week, we mostly just discussed the scriptural like backing for God's omniscience, and then I also discussed middle knowledge. So this week we're going to dive into the philosophical discussion. So if you thought last week wasn't philosophical, we're going to get more into it. So omniscience philosophically just means basically that God knows all true propositions. That's what we mean by omniscience. It's about truth. That's so for any, I'm going to write on the board again because it's my favorite thing to do. So in philosophy, we like to use letters to signify things. So we'll just say that P is a true proposition. It can be any proposition. And that if it's true, God knows it. And then that God does not believe not P. So this is any not true proposition. So this is like what we classically mean when we're talking about omniscience, that God just knows true facts, like he has knowledge of true facts. So it could be that God knows that yesterday Obama was the president and that today Trump is the president. So like God knows those things. And he does not believe that yesterday Obama was not the president. He doesn't have false beliefs. And this applies to all knowledge. Now, there are other types of knowledge, so I'm going to sort of get into that. And the way I like to describe it is that God actually is more than omniscient. He has more knowledge than just what we mean by omniscience. Because you can sort of conceive of a computer that could basically know all truths. Like it could be programmed to know everything that's true, and that computer would set to be omniscient. But God has more than that. So the type of knowledge I'm talking about is what is called self-knowledge. That God also possesses self-knowledge. All my examples are going to be about David, but he's not here today, so I can't pick on him. No, use him anyway? Yeah. I'm going to use David first, because I like this one. So let's imagine that David is out hunting, because he loves to hunt, or he used to. I don't know if he can anymore because of his knees. But David's out hunting, and all of a sudden, a buck charges him out of nowhere. This buck might be mad that he's killing all the ducks. So this buck decides to get revenge. So this buck chases David, and even with like his bad knee, he can't run that fast, so he climbs up a tree. And so this buck is like bucking at the bottom of the tree, and I'm there with him. And the buck didn't come after me because it saw David, and obviously that's who you'd go after. And so David yells to me like, "Go tell Linda I've been chased up a tree by a buck." So then I run to Linda, and I don't tell Linda I've been chased up a tree by a buck. I tell her David has been chased up a tree by a buck. Now, the information in those statements is the same. It's the same propositional truth, but yet the knowledge is slightly different. So that's what we mean by like self-knowledge, like that David and I respond differently to that propositional truth. The propositional truth of David being stuck in a tree because he was chased there by a buck, we react different. I go run and tell Linda, David hangs on for dear life. It's the same information, but we both react to it differently because David has the self-knowledge that I'm up in this tree because I got chased here by an angry buck. I shouldn't kill so many ducks. So This type of knowledge is knowledge that God also possesses. God has the self-knowledge of I am God. And it's also something that's cool to think about, that each one of you has a piece of knowledge that only you possess. God doesn't even possess it, that you are who you are. I am Ben Smith. I am me. God doesn't have that knowledge. I'm the one who possesses this knowledge. I'm the only one who possesses it. Just that Adam is the only one who possesses knowledge that I am Adam. And the same applies to all of you. Now, a key point about this is that I think, we talked about this a couple classes ago, I think that this is part of what it means to be made in God's image. That we have this self-knowledge like God. That self-knowledge is sort of a reflection of the image of God. It's sort of the image of the divine in us. It's a characteristic of the soul. Like it's, animals, as far as we know, don't have this self-knowledge. I mean, they're even trying to teach it right now to apes. They're trying to teach them self-knowledge and they can't. They're unsuccessful. So, does anybody have any questions about self-knowledge? Do people sort of understand what I mean by self-knowledge? I mean, I think it's very self-explanatory. I am me. And so, it's wrong to think that omniscience is sort of include all self-knowledge, because it doesn't. Like, God can't say, I am Tommy, I am Ben, no, God is God. And I am Ben, and Tommy is Tommy. Like, if it's to say that God has all of this self-knowledge, would be an imperfection in God. Sort of, God is not these other people. So, I think that's a key understanding. Another part of omniscience, that's not part of omniscience, that I sort of discussed last week, is that God doesn't learn anything. You could think of, you have two beings, and they could have the same amount of propositional knowledge. Imagine one of these beings being God and one just being Bob. Let's just say Bob, for example. Not any specific Bob. This guy, Bob. Now, Bob gets all the propositional truth because God tells him it. They both have the same amount of knowledge. However, God didn't learn this knowledge. He has it innately by the nature of being God. So again, even though Bob and God are both omniscient in terms of they know all truth, Bob had to learn it. Bob had to learn it from God. God did not have to learn it. So again, I just want to sort of talk about those things, because like when you just say God is just omniscient, he's also more than the classical definition of omniscience. He is greater than omniscient. Because he is a person, he has self-knowledge, and because he didn't learn any of his knowledge. Anybody have any questions about that? So these are...
Are you saying that I know me, but God doesn't know me? He's not a mind reader?
No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm talking about that God can't say, I am Bill. Now, things about you are propositional truths. So God can know things about you, but that's not being the same as being you. God is not you, but he knows you. Does that make sense? Like God can't say, I am Bill. Only you can say that. Yes. The information of Bill's a great guy, Bill's a conversationalist. These are like truths about you, but that's not the same as saying I am you. I know these things about you. Okay. So those are sort of the other types of knowledge I talked about, and sort of you can see. Oh, wait. I am very, very sorry, Adam. You should have told me.
Ben, you gotta hand out the papers.
Pens are there. Again, these are for your own personal use. If you want to take notes, hopefully you can remember everything I just said. The beginning was, like I said, just the philosophical definition of omniscience. Oh, I need one, Adam.
Wait, who am I?
Who are you? If I am you and you are me.
You have a question in the back.
Hi. So in the Bible, it says that God, he says, I know every hair on your head and, every part of your being. And then he created us. So he created us in his image and likeness. But I understand that, he can't say that I am Ben, but he created us and wired us in a certain way.
I mean, I think what you're leading towards is that God knows what it's like to be me. Like, he knows what it's like to be Ben. He knows exactly what it's like to be Ben, but he is still not Ben in the same way that, and I think that's sort of what you're sort of leading to, is that, yes, he created us, and he also has all the knowledge that we have, and he knows exactly what it's like to be us, but he is not us.
So Ben, it's really the experience. You have experienced being Ben. It's really, that's what the...
I mean, it's more than experience. Like, it's not just that I have the experience of being Ben, it's that I am a self. Like, I am me. Like, the statement I am, I understand that statement. Like, there is this selfhood. It's not just an experience. Like, someone else could have all the same experiences that I have, but then they would not be me. Like, if I had like a conjoined twin and we went through everything together, like, we'd still be two separate beings. Josiah was sort of making a joke, but it made me think of something. And he was like, oh, what if I forgot who I was? Like, who am I?
That's why you have your wallet.
And so I wanted to make another example of that, like, going back to propositional truth, like, if I had lost my memory, the information of, like, hey, Ben Smith is hungry, like, if I lost my memory, that doesn't mean anything to me. So, like, I would have to know that either I am Ben Smith or that I am hungry. So this, again, is an illustration of self-knowledge. You have to have the self-knowledge for those two things to mean anything. So, like I said, the information of Ben Smith is hungry and the information of I am hungry have the same truth value, but it's a different type of knowledge. So, again, that's just another illustration of self-knowledge. So that's what I mean by other types of knowledge on the worksheet. Now, as we started to go into last week, the attribute of God being all-knowing, of having omniscience, brings up some problems. There's these issues that arise. And we sort of dove into one a little bit in the question time. And basically, it goes sort of like this. If God knows in advance every choice you'll ever make, then isn't everything fated to occur? Or if God knows in advance every choice you're going to make, how could you ever choose to do something different than what God already knows? Now, this is called fatalism. And not fatal as in death, fatal as in fate. Fate. And if you're a Christian who believes in this, you're like a theological fatalist. And there are many Christians who do ascribe to this. A famous one is Martin Luther, who's also one of my favorite guys. And he was the one who started the Protestant Reformation. Again, I sort of discussed last week that, we're not designated a Protestant church, but it's because of him that we have sort of these independent churches that we can trace it. We can thank him for basically translating the Bible, taking it out of the hands of like the clergy, giving it to the people. And he was, though, a fatalist. I think he was wrong. Like I said, I'm sort of arguing for my stance. So you're welcome to disagree with me. And like I said, on this point, I think Martin Luther was wrong. But I bring that up to illustrate that, I said this many times, that too many times Christians get hung up on particular doctrines. And, we sort of let that separate us and come between us. And I think I'm bringing up Martin Luther to illustrate that he believes something very differently than I do, but yet we're both still Christians and we both still worship the same God. Hold on, not yet. And I started to think, if you take anything from my class, that's sort of the overriding thing I want you to take, is that, like, don't let sort of some of these doctrines separate us. There are those absolutes that Dave talks about, that when you come on Sunday, you'll hear him talk about those things. But then these other things are sort of, it's not the same as differences in worship. But, sometimes people like this type of worship music. Sometimes people like this type of worship music. It's not to say one of those is wrong and one isn't. Doctrine is more dealing with sort of truth claims. But again, their priority level sort of goes out the further you get away from the central truths. And I do think that fatalism can become a problem, and that's what I'm going to get into. But again, I wanted to talk about Martin Luther and how great of a man I think he is. And he was also someone who sort of after my own heart. This isn't Sunday, so I think I can sort of say this. He sort of had this quote that, like, I'm going to paraphrase it, but he was like, whoever drinks beer will be quick to fall asleep. And he's like, but if you're asleep a lot, you can't sin. And he's like, and if you can't sin, you have a greater chance of getting to heaven. He's like, so let us all drink beer. So, I mean, Martin Luther was that kind of guy. And no, I'm not here to go on to the doctrine of drinking or not drinking. I'm not here to talk about that. So, Tommy, you can ask your question.
Question. I just wanted to see if you could I'm sorry, could you just repeat what fatalism is again? I'm sorry.
Fatalism is that basically there's no free will, that everything that happens is fated to happen. That because God knows what's going to happen, that we can't do anything else.
Is that different from middle knowledge?
Yes.
It is? Okay.
Yes. I mean, you should listen to last week's and I'll explain middle knowledge.
Follow
I'll
up.
get into it again.
Follow up.
Yeah.
So fatalism is saying that there is no free will.
Yes.
But can you believe that you are fated for what's going to, like, if I believe that God knows everything that's going to happen to me in my life, but I still have free will to do whatever I want, I'm thinking that I have free will no matter what, and God knows if I will choose to go with him or choose to go a different direction. So I still have free will, but I still believe in fate either way.
Well, I mean, you would have to define fate, sort of what you mean by fate. Like, basically what I'm saying, fatalism is not sort of like God just has this plan or God is sort of trying to guide our lives. I'm saying fate is that there is no free will in this sense. Like everything.
Okay, so this is
fated.
God has pre-planned
Yes.
everything.
Yes.
And I don't have a choice.
Yes,
Okay.
that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about fatalism in this context.
Do fatalists believe that they have no choice?
Or does every choice just lead to the same end?
Or does every
Does
choice
every choice
just-
lead to the same
I mean, there's
fate?
different types, but like a hardcore Calvinist would be, they believe in like predestination, that everything has sort of been predestined. Like I said, Luther believed in predestination. Yeah. I think Patty has a question.
For people that it's kind of like live a law instead of, it just seems like it's kind of, you're mentioning a lot of those denominations that live by law, like you said, like, well, if I fall asleep, then I won't sin. Like,
I mean, he was being
so
glib.
the fatalistic, I know, but it's, there is no free will. If you just do it this way, then you're going to be okay. That kind of like.
No, I mean, it would be more that like you are a Christian because God has predestined you to be a Christian. Like you actually haven't made the choice. Like there isn't really free choice. But before we dive too deep into some of these questions, let me sort of present some of this more, because there's like an argument that a fatalist will give. And if you came to my classes last year, you'll recognize arguments and philosophical arguments. So again, remember the arguments have premises. So this one is necessarily if God foreknows X, and then X is just any sort of future event, like God foreknows X, then X will happen. And then number two is just God foreknows X. Because as we discussed, even in the Bible, it says that God does know the future. And then our conclusion is, therefore, necessarily, X will happen. Now, so this is like an argument for fatalism. This is actually a false argument, and I'll get into why in a second. But it's when I was sort of explaining philosophical arguments, you got to go through the premises, and then does the conclusion follow from the premise? And then this one is actually fallacious. Before I get into like sort of why, I want you to sort of, let's just think of any sort of event, like not a choice. Let's just think of a natural event. Could be anything. Let's use like the moon phases, and that, you know, we know that on such and such a date it's going to be like a full moon. Now, that is to say that God then also knows that this, with God's foreknowledge, God also knows when like it's going to be a full moon on such and such a date, such and such a time. Now, the reason it's going to be a full moon is because of the position of the star, the sun, with the earth, and all that stuff. There's a lot of scientific reasons. Now, take God's foreknowledge out of that. Let's just say that God doesn't have foreknowledge. Like, does it change anything about the full moon? Like, God knowing or not knowing doesn't change anything about the date and time that the full moon is going to occur. Neither does our knowledge of it. Like, the reason this happens is because of other things. Other sort of, like I said, movements of the planets, movements of the sun. Now, again, we can do the same thing with choice. Take a choice you make. I'm going to actually leave that up there. But if you take a choice you make, yes, there are reasons for you to make that choice. There are all these things that go into you making that choice. Now, I'm saying that with God's foreknowledge, he knows the choice we're going to make. But what does that knowledge have to do with causation? The things that cause us to make that choice are all these other things. You know, whether it be, you know, tomorrow for lunch, I may get a slice of pizza because all of a sudden I saw a commercial for pizza. I'm craving pizza. Pizza's just good. Now, I could say like, oh, God also knows I'm going to get pizza. But then you can also just say God doesn't know. We can say God doesn't have foreknowledge. That still doesn't affect me getting pizza or not getting pizza. So foreknowledge is not predestination. And I think a lot of people confuse foreknowledge with predestination or foreordaining. Like some people think that, you know, we'll say that God foreordains something. And I want to sort of differentiate Luther here. Luther did not believe that we are fated because God knows it. Luther believed that God foreordains things, and then that's why God has foreknowledge. Here we're just talking about God's knowledge. I'm not talking about God foreordaining the future, God predestining the future. We're talking just strictly about knowledge. So in sort of defense of Luther, like I said, Luther doesn't believe that God's knowledge is the reason we do things. Knowledge, as I said, is not causal. God's knowledge is not like if we have the knowledge, it can affect the reasons why. You know, that's why, you know, sometimes it's good, like in church, you know, like Tommy spoke about prophetic words. You know, God can want us to sort of do certain things, and we'll get information to sort of affect our decisions. But it's when God just has the knowledge and we don't know about it, it's not a causal effect. And again, I remember I spoke last week about chronological priority versus logical priority, like that just because God knows what we're going to do, it doesn't cause us to do it. You know, our decisions are what cause God to have the knowledge. That's how it works. Like, so some future time we make a choice, that choice is what causes God to know what that choice is. So the reason this is a fallacious argument is because the conclusion should actually just be X will happen. Then X will happen. So again, it's not necessary that X will happen. Necessary is just actually thrown into this argument arbitrarily by the fatalist. You know, both of these things, there's no sort of justification for that to be in there. You know, they're basically just saying that if God, this argument is saying that if God knows it, then therefore it's necessary, but it doesn't need to be necessary. It's just that if God foreknows X, then X will happen. But it doesn't happen necessarily. It's not fated to happen. I'm going to keep sort of, yes.
I have a question. If you change that If you left necessarily in and said necessarily if God foreordains X, then X will happen.
You'd have to.
You're changing foreknows to foreordains?
Yeah, okay, I see.
If you leave necessarily in, is that then?
If God
Is that,
for.
are you saying then that's true? Say foreknows
No, it would have to then also be.
necessarily.
It would have to be. X will happen necessarily. That's what it's missing. But then you have to argue then for this. Like, why would that happen necessarily? Like, why does that fated happen? Like, because remember what necessary means is that nothing else could have happened. Necessarily means like it has to happen that way. So again, you'd have to argue for the first premise. I don't think this is obvious. I don't think it's common sense. That's why I said they can't just throw in necessarily and then throw it in the conclusion either. I think with foreordained, this is a more valid argument. Like that could be true. I don't want to get too much into foreordination and predestination right now. It is something we will talk about when we get to the sort of the doctrine of salvation. That's when I'm going to talk about it more. I mean, you can ask questions about it, but I just don't want people to confuse foreknowledge with foreordination.
So the scripture says that God knows the end from the beginning, but that doesn't necessarily, that he sees the end from the beginning, but it doesn't mean that his hand directs what is about to happen.
Yes.
Just because he knows, obviously he sees everything and knows what is to come, doesn't mean that he has affected it. It's really sometimes just choices that we have made.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, actually, I'm going to skip that. But I'm just adding to the fire. Again, so this word fate or necessary is just arbitrary, So actually, I will do this. So this is a timeline, so future, and then this is the past, and then there's this event, E. Now, like I said, imagine this event. For one, let's imagine this event is me getting pizza for lunch tomorrow. Now, there are a bunch of prior things that cause that to happen. Like I'm hungry at lunch. I may have saw a commercial for pizza, or I may drove past the pizza place, or I may just really want a piece of pizza because it's really good. Ooh, that'd be even better. And then also back here is God's knowledge of E. God's knowledge of E is not one of these causes. Like it doesn't cause me to get the piece of pizza.
How do we know he hasn't put one of those things in our way to lead us to that conclusion?
But we're talking about knowledge. I'm talking about omniscience. And you're supposed to use the microphone. So, and again, and this could also be not a choice. This could be, there could be, this is a cell in Tommy's body splitting right now. And there's a bunch of scientific things that cause that to happen. God knows what's going on in every cell in all of our bodies, but his knowledge of that doesn't cause cells to split, it could be his creative power or his omnipotence could have a hand in that, but this is just omniscience we're talking about. So fate in knowledge is just arbitrary. Like when people say because God knows something is fated, they're just throwing fate in there arbitrarily, because you can remove God's knowledge and these things still happen. It could still happen whether or not God knows about it or not. So again, why does God knowing about it cause it to be fated? So that's sort of where I'm at with this problem of knowledge. And because God knowing it, then we can't do anything else because God knows it. Anybody have more questions about this?
It's on. My understanding has always been that God is all-knowing, so he's not bound by time and space.
Yes.
So he gives us free will. Doesn't have to, but that's what he did. So we can do what we want, but he knows what the outcome's going to be. He knows the future. He's not causing us to do it, is what you're saying.
Yes, that
But
his
he
knowledge.
knows it, because
I
he
mean,
knows
he-
everything.
He may be causing us to do it, but it's not based on his knowledge. That's a separate argument.
Yeah, if he wants to, he can cause us to do things.
Yes.
Okay.
Over here.
Martin Luther is one of my favorite people too. I was raised Lutheran, and I won the Martin Luther essay contest in my church.
Wow.
They gave me $5.
It's probably worth a lot back then.
Are your I don't want to.
Sorry.
I don't want to characterize what you're talking about as argumentative, but are you arguing from the Protestant point of view, or let's say the Catholic point of view, or the Mormon? Or
I mean, I would say I'm arguing from a biblical point, like a Christian point of view. That's like my understanding of what the Bible says, and also my philosophical understanding about omniscience, and also about what I think, who I think God is. In the first class of this cycle, I talked about that we're going to base this on what I called perfect being theology. That God should have these attributes, and they should be in the greatest conceivable way. So again, I think if God doesn't have knowledge of the future, like it's sort of goes against both what the Bible says and also about him being the greatest possible being. It's the same thing with that self-knowledge. If we said that God had all self-knowledge, that would be an imperfection. Like if God thought he was me and God thought he was Adam and God thought he was someone else, that would be an imperfection. It's a perfection for God to know who he is.
Phil had a word of knowledge. There's a Hyundai who left their lights on, and if fate follows true, we'll have to give it jumper cables. So I don't know if it's in the... We know what the fate will
And
be if we don't
if he were not to go turn his lights off, then his battery might die. Ooh, God might know. Just a joke. So now we're going to go into the second problem, and this is one that's posed by middle knowledge. And as I remember, middle knowledge is these if-then statements that don't necessarily always happen. So I talked about the verse from 1 Samuel when David went down to Keilah, and then he asked God, like, if I stay here, will they hand me over to Saul? God says, like, if you stay there, they will. But then David left, and then Saul never came down, David never got handed. So that is what's called a subjunctive conditional statement. It's an if-then statement. I gave the example of, like, if I were David, then I would sell my boat, things like that. If I were Tommy, then I would eat pizza tomorrow. So the doctrine of middle knowledge states that God knows the truth of these types of statements, that God would know that if I were to have lived during, the first century, then I would be a follower of Christ or I would not be a follower of Christ. God knows the truth of those kind of statements. That's sort of, another word for it is like hypothetical knowledge. So that, like, if middle knowledge is confusing, so God knows the truth of, like, these kind of things. So the problem that arises from this, that people bring up, that if God then knew before he created anything, basically what would happen to this world. So the statement would be that if God were to create the world, then man would reject him and fall into sin. And that God knew this before he created the world. So then the question is, like, why then did God create the world? Like, why would God do this knowing all the awful things that happen? I mean, you just have to go through history to look at it. I always know the Holocaust is a classic example, but there's, human history is just rife with suffering and bloodshed and all these things, slavery, all the wars, constant wars. So that's the problem. When one sort of looks at how messed up the world is, like we ask the question, like why would God create this world if he knew it was just going to turn to this? Like if he had this middle knowledge, like if he had this hypothetical knowledge, then why do it? Why would he allow all this evil to happen? Why create it? You know, someone who doesn't believe in hypothetical knowledge would say that before God created the world, he didn't know what man was going to do. He didn't know until after he created man. So that's sort of an objection to middle knowledge, and it's a problem that arises from middle knowledge if you're someone who holds to middle knowledge. And I'm sort of going to go about answering this question, but does everybody understand the problem? Does anyone have any questions? I know Tommy's probably wants to know more about middle knowledge. So I'm going to go about sort of in my way answering this problem. And I think that let me write it up actually. That like, if God knew that man was going to reject him, I'll just say it like that. Then why create the world? And I put reject him in there because that just means basically, like I'm saying, sin, all the awful things that come from sin. Like I said, all the horrors, all the terrible, terrible things. And so the first response I sort of have to this is God's options may actually have been limited. And you might sound like, oh, isn't God all powerful? But what I mean is that when God creates free moral agents, he can't directly control them. So he may have been limited in the type of world that God could have created. You know, people might say, like, why didn't God just create a world where there was no suffering? Well, for him to do that, he might have had to completely take away freedom. You know, we might all then just be like these blissful robots that don't have choice. So given like human freedom, like this may be one of the best worlds that could be possible with the amount of, let's say, there's almost 8 billion people, or is there over 8 billion people on the world that, were you going to ask a question? Oh, okay. So given the fact that there's like 8 billion free moral creatures on the world, that this may actually be like the most good that's possible with that many free moral agents. I'm not saying that it is, but I'm saying we don't know that. Like, we don't know that this might not be one of the better possible worlds that there is. Because I think that free will is a very important attribute to have. And the reason so is that I think that the greatest possible ethic is love. Like, love is the greatest thing. I mean, when Christ said that, like, teacher, what is the best commandment? And he said, love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. And that's just to love each other, to love God. And that love is meaningless without freedom. So I think if you're someone who doesn't think that free will exists, and this is sort of how I would approach Luther, I mean, in that, like, love is meaningless without free will. Like, if you're just a robot, like, love doesn't mean anything. You can't coerce someone to love you. The moment you do, like, it's not love. You know, you can't buy someone's love. You can't force someone to love you. And, like, God created us to be in a loving relationship with him. That was sort of our purpose. And he had to give us complete freedom, I think, to do that. And as I said, this may be the best possible world that there is, you know, because to choose to love also means you have to be able to choose to reject. You have to be able to choose to hate, or else love doesn't mean anything. And so I think that the freedom to choose love is, as hard as this imagine, is even greater than all the suffering that we see around us. And that it can be a struggle to deal with that, but the possibility of just like loving each other and loving God and like being able to achieve that is just amazing. I think that's amazing. Tommy, you can ask a question.
Thank you. So I think that like what you wrote on there is actually a very poor argument against middle knowledge. And the reason why I would say that is because like if I knew I was going to have 10 children and I knew that the first 9 children were going to reject me and not like me, that wouldn't cause me to not want to have the 9 children and still enjoy the moments that I did have with them where I felt love back from them, right? And then if I knew that the 10th one was going to like me, so like that's a poor argument because like just because God knew man was going to reject him, wouldn't that like to me that would make me say, well, God wouldn't want to create the world then, because there are still some of his children that do love him back, and that love and that joy, I think God appreciates to the point that it makes it all worth it. So I think that's a very poor argument against hypothetical knowledge.
I mean, I agree. And that, I mean, like I said, this is typically the response people will give to middle knowledge. It's not necessarily my response. I'm just saying this is what you'll hear. That, I mean, this is also brings up the problem of pain and suffering. This is a big lead into that. Jerry, I think you had a comment or a question?
Comment, yeah. Jesus said the greatest act of love was to lay down your life for one another.
Yes.
And why would people lay down their lives? Because there's evil in the world. There's bad things. Goodness doesn't really shine without evil.
Exactly. And, you know, like, look at the people we call heroes are oftentimes people that give their lives for someone else. And you can sort of imagine if someone didn't have a choice, like, and you're forced to give their life to save someone else, that would be like the complete, we would think of that as horrific. We would think, how could you force someone to do that? But yet the minute someone chooses to do that, it becomes the complete opposite. It becomes heroic. It becomes great. You know, so I think I'll let you ask your question before I get into the point I was going to make.
I have a question about the flood,
Okay.
and I don't know how to word it.
I don't know if I'm going to know the answer.
What? So that's my question. So basically, God flooded the earth because it was just Noah and his family left
Yes.
as the only people righteous or loving at all. So he basically reset, aside from Noah and his family and the animals. So why would you reset the world if we're designed to be free to reject?
You're going to have to ask him that question.
Okay. Okay. No, that's fine. It's just that's all.
I mean, God is also like the only perfect judge. Like, you know, God is a perfect judge. God knows, like I said, this knowledge, God knows exactly the way people are. Like, he knows people's hearts, so he can see the world and see that actually all these people are incredibly awful. They've like gone off the deep end. They've chosen to be the most awful people in the world. And so God is the perfect judge. Like, God is the most fair. Like, we can't then say like, oh, how could God do that? Well, God knows better than us. Like, you know, once I think it's revealed and once you sort of stand before God and are judged, you're gonna be like, oh yeah, you're right. You know, I have no arguments, you know.
Okay. All right.
Who wants? Sorry.
Well, that's what I was going to say, because when you look at that argument, if God knew man was going to reject him, then why create the world? That's actually us putting what we think God would think.
Yeah.
I mean, he's love, so he doesn't even think of rejection, I would think. I don't know. Like, I really don't know, but I can't even imagine that kind of love when there is no, you know, there's no hopelessness, he always, you know what I'm saying? It's kind of like, it's hard to even imagine. So he always has that.
Yeah, I mean, oftentimes when we love, if like we're rejected, like we stop loving, or like God doesn't.
Yeah, we got to work through it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Who's next?
And I forgot the point I was going to make when I interrupted Adam, but it'll come back to me.
Well, God, the flood, God cleaned house. But I think the reason was to show us that without God, there's only sin and evil. And there was only a few people, obviously Noah's family, that were left that were righteous and knew him. And they were, he started over with them. And then he could bring Christ later on as our Savior, because we couldn't save ourselves.
Yeah. I mean,
So
God
it's
may
all part
have,
of his,
like I said, with middle knowledge, God may have known that, for him to eventually send his son, like the flood would have happened. Like if the flood didn't happen, Noah's line may have been killed, and then Christ never would have been able to be born. Like there's all these things in middle knowledge that are crazy. Like you can't even, when you start to think about it, it'll hurt your head. You don't have to raise your hands.
So with that knowledge, he then can kind of interject himself into our life whenever he sees the need to. So at that point, like, why can't he just interject whenever he wants to?
I mean, he could whenever he wants to, but like I said, if he restricts our freedom too much, then like I said, that loving relationship becomes meaningless. And it's also, God also respects that freedom. People are free to do all the awful things they do. God doesn't like come in and stop them because he created us to be free. He accepts like our rejection.
But then why step in at all then, or anytime?
Oh, because I think people like are seeking God. And so when we are choosing to seek God, he's going to step in because we're actually seeking him. That's, I think, when God, like I said, when people come to church and like get prayed for, like God might come in and sort of give them type of answer or type of reassurance because we are seeking God. People that completely reject God, like God's not necessarily going to step in because they don't really want to have anything to do with him. And this sort of gets into the question. I'm not going to go down there. Never mind. That's a later date.
Yeah, so I think really what I see here also with Doug's point is when we become believers and give our hearts to the Lord, the very deposit of the Holy Spirit is put into our hearts, and he does direct us which ways we should go. So he does, once we yield to him and give our hearts to him, he does and is very interested in influencing that we make the correct decisions led by the Holy Spirit.
Yeah. I mean, I think that in every situation, for every person, God wants those people to do the right thing, but they don't always choose to, and if God was sort of trying to create like this world of people always doing the right thing, he would just make people do the right thing. But he's more concerned with us, giving us freedom, and I said that goes back to the freedom to love him and to love each other.
Right. It's really incredible when you think about it that the King of the universe is looking for people that want to fall in love with him, and he doesn't force us to. And that's what is so pleasing to him, is that we, of our own free will and volition, fall in love with him when we see his goodness and all that he's done for us. And again, he could have made robots. I think the angels look down and say, because they don't have that choice that we have. And I think the angels are amazed at, what God has created in man.
Yeah, I won't dive into angels either right now. I don't want to go down too many trails because you can start up a whole nother discussion and get lost. So any more points or questions before I wrap it up? Make some points before I finish. So this is the first attribute that took 2 weeks, omniscience, and it is the most probably discussed attribute of God. Like I said, there are total different denominations that believe totally different things about God's knowledge. That actually reminds me, I didn't write this in my notes, but there is a sort of current movement right now in response to this sort of predestination that's called open theism, that believes God doesn't foreknow the future of our choices, that God can't know what the result of a free choice is going to be. It might sound appealing, but it's sort of non-biblical. There is no, like the Bible says that God does know our minds, our hearts, our choices. So I said earlier in this class that sometimes people will develop these doctrines because they don't want to deal with the problems. They don't want to deal with these questions. So instead of dealing with the question, they are sort of just saying, oh, well, all right, God can't actually know what a free choice is going to be. Again, though, I don't think that those people are not Christians. I'm not saying that they're not Christians. But again, this is the point I wanted to make. That, thank you, finally came back to me. When you question these things, or when I question these things, or when people question, when you say like, oh, like if God knows everything that we're going to do, then we don't have free will. That's not just like a statement that's just left there. There's consequences to then if that's the truth. Like I said, that doesn't really make sense biblically. So you're sort of saying, okay, you're taking something outside and saying, all right, God doesn't actually have foreknowledge of the future. But the Bible is, I went through it in the first class, the Bible is pretty clear that God does have foreknowledge of the things we're going to do. So, when people say things like that, it's like Tommy said, that there's another side to that then. You can't just sort of throw out this blanket statement and be like, well, this is the way it is. Same with fatalism. You can't just say that, oh, because everything is foreknown, then everything is fated. And that's what I meant by being arbitrary. Like there are sort of consequences to this that I do have it in my notes. Sorry, got to pause for a second. Like if everything was fated, even predestined, everything, that's sort of the problem this creates is a God that I don't want to believe in. That makes God responsible for all these evils. That makes God responsible for the Holocaust. That makes God responsible for sin. That makes God responsible for all the terrible things that people do to each other if people don't have choice. This sort of turns God into this moral monster. And this is sort of not the God of the Bible. It's not the way God is described. There are parts in the God's judgment seems pretty harsh, which is, again, another argument. But like that's not a God I believe in. Like I don't believe in a God that caused the Holocaust, that caused slavery. And when you take choice out of it, then God did cause those things. That's the consequence of saying that we are predestined or we are foreordained by God. That makes God responsible for all the evils of the world. So let me just wrap it up with what are some of those ways we can think about God's omniscience? How does this affect our lives? I go on these deep philosophical things, but there are very practical things that this means is that God is completely trustworthy. Like God isn't going to be surprised by information. He's not going to like all of a sudden learn something and be like, oh man, I didn't see that coming. Oh, all those things I told you, I got to get rid of those, So like we can trust in God. The other thing that I think is especially big for me is that, we can take comfort in that God knows you completely. Like he knows everything about you. And yet he still loves you. Like he loves every awful thing you think, every awful thing I think, every awful thing I want to do. And like, despite all that, like he still loves me. He still wants to spend all his time with me. I'm not married, but I imagine many of you are married, and it's just like, there's even those things you're like, I'm never going to tell my spouse that. I'm never going to tell my wife or husband that. And it's not always things you do, but it's just things you think and like God knows all this. God knows everything in your heart and your mind, and yet he loves you. Like he loves you with all his heart. And, that's just like incredible to me. And that this also gives us like this security. Like God's not going to leave us. God's not going to leave us because we have some awful thought or we do some awful thing. There might be severe consequences of those things. But when we come back to God, he still opens his arms. He still loves us. I can't say I would do that. Somebody did some awful thing to me, I would probably reject them. I think that's an amazing thing about God and God's omniscience. God knows. God knows everything you've ever done, everything you want to do, everything you think to do. That's why you sort of focus more on him. You're going to start to want to do the right things. It's not that God makes you. It's you just sort of realize that, oh, God knows everything I'm thinking. Maybe I'll start thinking better things. Not because like he's making us feel guilty. That's not what I'm trying to say. But that's a different. Come on Sunday, and Dave talks more about that stuff. Dave will. All right, so that's it. So thanks for coming. We will be here next week.